Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. This afternoon, I thought I would go over some of the basics of meditation practice. Mostly probably stuff you've all heard before, but it's useful to have a refresher review now and again. First of all, what do we mean with this word meditation? In Pali, there's at least a couple of different words that are used. Bhavana, the literal meaning is development or coming into being. So the practice of formal meditation is sometimes referred to as bhavana or development. So we're developing the mind. It's a exercise for the mind, just like we have exercises for the body to develop stamina or strength. So with the mind, we develop qualities, desirable qualities of the mind with the bhavana. Another word that's commonly used, particularly when it's a verb referring to like to meditate, this is very commonly used, is janeti, which means to do jhana. So jhana is not inseparable from the basis of meditation. Another word of some importance is samadhi. It comes in the Eightfold Noble Path from Buddha's very first sermon. This is actually the last factor in the path. The eighth factor is right samadhi, sama samadhi. And it's defined as being first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana. Practicing those or towards those. So samadhi also occurs in the list of the 7 enlightenment factors and occurs in other places as well. And it's important to distinguish exactly what this word means because it's been mistranslated. The commonly established translation is concentration. When you read a book in English on Buddhist meditation, you'll see concentration meditation frequently used. And I think that's a very misleading translation, but there's several of these kind of translations that got fixed early on and became traditional, and it's difficult to get away from them because everybody knows them. So you'll see the Eightfold Path, for example, sometimes very commonly actually, the last factor will be listed as right concentration. The reason I don't like concentration as a word to translate samadhi is because to concentrate something, it means you make it small, you bring it to a point. And this is completely wrong for samadhi. Samadhi is actually defined in the commentarial literature and the Abhidhamma as well as non-wavering or stability, which is quite a different idea than concentration. It's stillness of mind, non-wavering. The mind is not moving about. And samadhi is, of course, essential quality for meditation. Now, the meditation practice itself, in the Theravada tradition, there are many different particular meditations. The Visuddhimagga lists 40 meditations. It's considered to be a kind of meditation manual in part. The Visuddhimagga has 40 meditations. And there are various methods and techniques that that are taught by particular teachers and traditions. If we go outside the Theravada, there are many more kinds of meditation. So there's a rich profusion of approaches, and I think it's important to keep in mind that there's no single one right way or best way for everybody at all times. There are all these different approaches and variations. So we can't get into all of them. But I want to talk about particularly two cornerstones of our practice. One is Anapanasati and the other is Vipassana. First of all, by way of introduction to that, I would say one classification that is sometimes made of meditation types, and I think it's a useful one, is between samatha and vipassana. Samatha are meditations which particularly aim at developing samadhi, this stillness of mind, this unity of mind, and culminate in the jhana states. And vipassana is any form of meditation which takes as its object the changing field of objects arising to consciousness with the aim of developing wisdom and finally culminating in the realization of the unconditioned by the exhaustion of samsara. And I think as a general principle, a healthy progressive meditation practice would involve some time spent in samatha and some time spent in vipassana. And the two strengthen each other. The very traditional way is to begin with samatha and then develop some skill in samatha, then move on to vipassana, because it is actually a more difficult meditation. So I'll talk about samatha first, using anapanasati as the primary example. But samatha meditation, as a general family of meditations, is based on the principle of you beginning the meditation by taking an object that is arbitrarily selected. Like you say, I'm going to watch the breath, or I'm going to do kasina meditation, which is meditation on a visual object. So you arbitrarily choose an object to meditate on, and that becomes your object of meditation. As another general principle, we say that any object you take for samatha meditation is limited to one sense base, ideally. So with the kasina meditation, it's the visual sense, and with anapanasati, it's the sense of touch, the tactile sense. You're feeling the breath. This is another point of language that sometimes people get confused on, is to say watching the breath. The watching is not to be taken literally as like using your eyes. And I mean, that may sound like an obvious or trivial point, but years ago when I first started teaching meditation, there were a few people I would encounter who told me they were doing anapanasati, then they were getting a headache. First, I could not understand, why would you get a headache doing anapanasati? Well, I think if you have a headache, anapanasati should relieve it by relaxing the body-mind system. I don't see how you get a headache doing anapanasati. And I questioned, after about the third person who told me that, I questioned him in some detail about what he was doing, and finally it clicked on me what he was doing without being fully aware of it. He hears this instruction, watch the breath, And without him being fully even aware of what he was doing, with his eyes shut, he was kind of crossing his eyes so that his focus had been on his nose tip, and that strain was giving him a headache. And as soon as he realized that's what he was doing, he was able to stop and relax, and he was, then it was no longer a problem. So this is an example of how a careless use of language trips us up. Now, the Buddha said you can use conventional speech, but don't be fooled thereby. We should always be cautious about the use of these terms in Buddhism generally, and in meditation practice particularly, that you understand what they mean and don't rely on the simple, obvious English translation or meaning. So you're feeling the breath, and as in many other meditations, there are variations of approach to Anapanasati. The most traditional one is to feel the breath at the nose tip as it enters and exits the body. Another common point of focus is the abdomen. This is actually preferred in Zen tradition, that they'll notice the breath movement at the abdomen at a point below the navel. You can feel the motion of the abdomen up as it moves in reflex with the diaphragm as you breathe. And that's actually sometimes good for people who are very much caught up in their heads, who overthink everything. Sometimes it's good to get their consciousness down below the neck. And do the breath at the abdomen can be actually helpful for that. But generally in our tradition we use the nose tip. And the approach should be to let the breath come to the mind, not the other way around. Don't force the mind onto the breath. Make the mind passive, receptive, bright, open, clear, but pay attention only to the breath. And of course, other things arise in the mind, thoughts, daydreams, memories, also external stimulus like sounds or sensations elsewhere in the body. And the skill here in developing samatha practice is the skill of non-attention, of disregarding other dhammas that arise. Not trying to suppress them, but just not paying attention to them, letting them wither away from non-attention. This is another thing that I found over the years, that many people in the West, many Western Buddhists, and this is actually my own case as well, they begin their practice, the first meditation they encounter is some form of vipassana. And they may do that for some time, maybe even for years, before they try to seriously do samatha. And that's kind of the reverse order or opposite order of what the ideal order should be. And what happens for very many of these people is they have difficulty developing samatha because they've been trained so well in paying attention to dhammas that they have difficulty grasping this other skill of non-attention to dhammas, and just letting them not be an object of awareness, not letting them be or I should say of attention, not letting them be an object of attention, just disregarding them. But that's what is needed for samatha. You pay attention only to the chosen object. And you're making progress in the samatha meditation if you feel more calm and spacious, if the mind becomes quieter, and it becomes easier to stay with the chosen object for longer stretches of time. when the mind is fully unified on an object, this is ekagata, the unity of mind, then there's an entrance into jhana, which is the mature state or perfected state of a samatha meditation. Now moving on to consider vipassana, it's usually translated as insight, which is acceptable. It's a good translation. It's the literal meaning of vipassana is clear seeing. The first thing to say about it is vipassana as such is not in itself actually a meditation. It's a frame of mind or an attitude or a way of holding the objects. And to facilitate that frame of mind, that attitude, there have been developed different techniques or methods of doing vipassana. And this is particularly the province of Burma. Burma or Myanmar has been very fruitful in its tradition of developing methods or techniques of vipassana. There's only a very few that have become popularly known outside of Burma, but in Burma there are many. The ideal of vipassana is to develop this clear seeing of the objects of consciousness, so that each object which arises is seen clearly and without grasping. One of the metaphors that is used by Mahasi Sayadaw, one of the great Burmese teachers, one of the metaphors that he uses is you're sitting in your car at a railway crossing and watching a long train go by. And each car passes by and you recognize the car as a box car, that's a tanker, that's a flatbed, whatever. You just watch them going by, but you don't get out of your car and follow one of them down the tracks. You're just momentarily aware of each one as it passes. And the nature of the mind, there's a constant stream, whether you're meditating or not, there's a constant stream of objects passing before the screen of consciousness. And the only difference with vipassana is we're trying to become fully conscious of that practice, of that process, and not to get lost in it. So here, there's a twofold skill to be developed for the vipassana. One is to be clearly aware of each object as it arises. And second skill is not to grasp onto anything. Let the objects just pass through consciousness. So one of the very critical qualities of mind that is needed is equanimity. This emotive stability, or calmness and clarity, so that one doesn't get involved in the objects. Because the tendency of the mind is to get lost in the stream of objects and identify with them and have emotional reactions to them, and then get caught up in the emotional states. And it's alternately some kind of positive reaction, or enjoyment, or some kind of negative reaction, fear or aversion. And the mind gets disturbed and thrown around by these reactions. Now, with Vipassana, you try and stay in a neutral position and be aware of each object. And also to make everything into an object. So if there is an emotional state arises, then to take that as the object. If thinking arises, then to take thought as the object. You can always step back into the knowing. Of course, this is the other way of talking about this. The Vipassana way is to focus on the objects, but the other way is to focus on the knowing, the citta. It's a way often spoken of in the Thai tradition. It amounts to the same thing. It's what you're doing in any given moment is knowing the object. There is only the object and mind knowing the object. There's a quite lovely word used in the Abhidhamma for the type of equanimity that is specifically required for deep vipassana. That's tatra majjhatthata, which translates literally as middleness about that. Bhikkhu Bodhi's translated it as specific neutrality. More explanatory. It's not as literal as middleness about that, but the idea is you're neutral, you're specifically neutral. So this is not a type of equanimity that's just kind of fuzzy and unclear. You're quite clear about the object, but you're neutral about it. So tatra is the participle meaning that, specifically this thing here. And I'm in the middle about it. I'm not swayed to one side or the other. I'm not swayed to fear or fascination. I'm in the middle, and not just generally in the middle, but I'm in the middle about that. And that is whatever is the object at this moment of consciousness. So when you have tatra majjhatthata happening, the objects are springing up as they do one after the other quite clearly, and your reaction to each is identical. It's just to see it in its own nature and not be swayed to enjoyment or aversion. So I think a good general principle for Vipassana is no object is so trivial it can be ignored, and no object is so important it needs to be held. If you remember that principle, then you can use that as a guiding for Vipassana. It's sometimes happens with people doing Vipassana that something comes up in their practice that they think is really important and they really need to deal with it right now. And so I need to examine this. Well, they're missing the point of it. There was a Burmese teacher who was asked once, when he was on a visit to America, somebody asked him, why is it that Burmese people seem to do so well with Vipassana meditation and take to it so easily, and many Americans and Westerners in general, they practice it for years and struggle with it and they don't seem to get anywhere. And this Burmese teacher said, from what my experience has been with Americans is that they don't do Vipassana, they're doing self-psychoanalysis. And this is something to watch out for. The purpose of Vipassana is not really to figure out and analyze your own particular history and quirks and neuroses, but to understand the nature of reality as it's experienced at a very deep level, the immediate experience of the here and now, This is the object of Vipassana. And Vipassana matures or culminates in wisdom, defined as seeing things in their own nature as they actually are. And that's particularly seeing them in terms of the three characteristics, which are not artificial categories we impose on reality. They're the very essence or nature of reality that presents itself to us if we are looking at objects with this proper holding with Tatra Majjhatthata. The three characteristics being dukkha, anicca, anatta. Dukkha, suffering or unsatisfying or imperfect. I think in terms of Vipassana, imperfection is probably the closest to English translation. Anicca's impermanence, the transient nature of phenomena, and anatta's not self, or the empty, the void nature of phenomena. And at first, when we first start to look at Dhammas passing through the mind, the particular nature of things is more evident. Like we see things as, thoughts and sense impressions, and we see them as pleasant or unpleasant, and as strong or weak. However, these sort of particular things. And that's part of seeing clearly, but it's not the deepest part. The deepest part is then seeing the universal aspect, which is the three characteristics, and they become more and more evident. That each object that arises has this nature. And there's an infinite variety of objects, but they're all variations on a theme. They're all imperfect, impermanent, and empty. As that becomes more and more evident, the mind begins to lose the passion for becoming. It begins to see the phenomena as impossible to satisfy the mind. So interest is lost in them in a way, and the desire or the passion for experience wanes. And that passion is the driving engine. This is desire, tanha. It's the driving engine of samsara. It's the force of becoming. It's what keeps us being born again and again. And it's what keeps us in each moment grasping for an object. It's this fool's game that we've been playing for billions of lifetimes. We grasp an object hoping to be satisfied and complete the mind and reach some sort of fulfillment. And the best the object can yield is a momentary feeling of sukha vedana, happy feeling. But it can't satisfy or complete or fulfill the mind. This is impossible because it's dukkha. It's imperfect. It's a fragment. It's a shard. It doesn't complete anything. And then the mind immediately then starts grasping for the next object. And it's again and again we do this. And when we do Vipassana, we don't stop that process immediately, but we make it conscious. So it begins to run down. Right? It's like you say you turn the engine off on your car, but you don't hit the brake. You're in neutral. You continue to roll for a long time because it's just the momentum of the inertia of movement. But you're not feeding it any new energy, so it eventually comes to a stop. This is like with the mind. It runs on and on for a shorter or longer period of time. But then eventually the momentum runs out. To quote Visuddhimagga, it does what it has not done since beginningless time, and alights upon non-occurrence. It just stops doing that. Well, that's nibbana. It's when you just stop doing samsara. And that's really all there is to it. You just stop doing samsara and there's nibbana. But we constantly doing samsara. We've woven a whole world, a whole cosmos out of our desires and our becomings. So, of these two meditation types, samatha and vipassana, vipassana is actually it's a higher meditation, uh, but it's also the more difficult one to do properly, and it is more fruitful. It's done more effectively if you develop some basis in samatha. Then vipassana can be done with more ease and more positive results. And it's very difficult. I would also say, as a general principle, it's very difficult when you're doing vipassana to judge your own progress. The mind goes through all kinds of phases during vipassana, and some of them can feel very much like you're going backwards, but you're not. You're just, going through a different thing, and it's very difficult to judge your own progress while you're in the midst of it. But if you're doing vipassana with some regularity, you can notice the changes in your mind over time. If you find yourself becoming more clear, more at peace, more equanimous, less easily upset or thrown by changing circumstances, less prone to panic or anger or anxiety. These are all fruits and signs of a developing practice. So I think I'll stop at that point. There's some remarks on meditation practice.
Andamayam Dhammakataya Sadhu Param Dharamase